Welcome everyone to Virtual Insights, Somewhere to Roost. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Mathilde Walker-Bio. I'm curator of programming at the American Folk Art Museum. Please note that closed captioning in English is available by clicking on the CC bottom of your screen. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenape-Hawking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape people, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. So, as many of you know, AFAM is dedicated to the work of self-taught artists across time and place. Second slide. And we're really happy and thrilled to offer a new perspective on the museum's collection with the exhibition Somewhere to Roost, now on view at 2 Lincoln Square until May 25th, 2025, so next year. Featuring a large range of objects, including paintings and sculptures, furniture, quilts, and photographs. This show highlights how self-taught and folk artists evoke a sense of home in their work, inviting us to consider the importance of sanctuary, comfort, and safety. So after Material Witness, folk and self-taught artists at work, and marvel of my own inventiveness, this exhibition is the third in a series of thematic shows drawn from the museum's collection. Generously supported by a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation, this series of exhibitions invites us to admire the museum's collection up close while showcasing an expansive history of American art. So I'm very pleased today to be joined by the curator of the exhibition Somewhere to Roost, Brooke Wyatt, Luce Assistant Curator at the American Folk Art Museum. So just a quick note on sequencing. Today, Brooke Wyatt will start the curatorial walkthrough with a short introduction to the exhibition, explaining its conceptual framework. And then following this introduction, Brooke Wyatt and I will be in conversation for about half an hour, followed by a Q&A with everyone. So please share your questions throughout the program using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We want to hear from you. And before I turn it to Brooke, I want to reiterate that closed captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And today's program is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. We are grateful for opportunities like this program to connect online, which will not be possible without you. I hope you'll consider supporting our program through a donation to the museum following this program. Your support has great impact and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of folk and self-taught artists. Thank you. So please welcome Brooke. Hi, Brooke, and it's so nice to have you with us today. We're very excited to learn more from you and hear more about what you've been up to in the museum's collection in Queens.
Thank you, Mathilde. I'm so glad that you mentioned the museum's collection storage facility in Queens, because my time spent with our colleagues there has had a big influence on this show, starting with this artwork that we're looking at now. I saw this for the first time when I was visiting collection storage, this painting by Miguel Perez. And the artist has named, you can see my cursor over here, this pitare bird and a lechuza owl, and provided a kind of road sign showing the Camino Real. So although he does not state the name of a specific location in Puerto Rico, knowing that the artist created this painting during a period of time while he was living and working in New York City, before eventually returning home to the island, we can imagine that the painting has a connection to his home. And it makes me think about tensions and connections between maybe our current place of residence versus the home of our childhood or of memory. That where we live and work may not be the place that we consider our spiritual home. And also a painting like this brings up questions for me about how time and distance, as well as the experience of crossing borders and living in a new place, can change our memories of where we came from, can change ourselves. What changes about us if we leave our home, and what if we return? Looking at this detail, it feels important to me that there are no human beings in this painting by Mike Perez. The presence of birds, though, reminds me that we share our home with many other species. And when I initially planned to include this painting in an exhibition exploring themes of home, I had no idea how much the message of the birds would become central to the exhibition. This work by Thornton Dial Sr. is called, quote, "Birds Got to Have Somewhere to Roost." It's a large construction. It's very heavy. As you look closely, you can see that it is made from repurposed building materials, planks of wood and corrugated metal. Big nails are holding these pieces together. The artist made this work drawing from a huge collection of materials that he assembled and maintained in his studio. In this photo, you can see him in his studio. This is Thornton Dial Sr. And he appears to be gesturing. I imagine that he's talking about an artwork that we can't see in this photo. It's out of this frame. The camera has recorded the motion of his hand. And there is a related kind of gestural movement in Birds Got to Have Somewhere to Roost, in the curling pieces of silver and gold metal that seem to grow out of the composition or almost to take flight. In Dial's practice, he often gives titles to his work that operate both literally and metaphorically. I borrowed his words for the title of this exhibition, Somewhere to Roost. As a roost is a nest, a place to rest, or a shelter, I can start to imagine birds finding places to build a nest in the various nooks and crannies created in Dial's construction.
I'm excited to think about these artworks, and what struck me in this introduction is how, especially in the case of Dials, how the habitat of the artist becomes an integral part of the artwork, and in that case of Dial, it becomes a medium. Like the home is a medium. We know that Dials was presenting his artworks, his sculptures in his yard, and the yard became an environment, a sculptural environment. So I would love for you to talk about this idea of considering the home as a medium, and through the collection, of course.
Yeah, with Dial, I also think about all of the building materials that he collected and then repurposed in his artwork. A lot of them are materials that could be used for building houses or furniture. He and his sons worked in a lawn furniture business. And I think that's where a lot of the thinner pieces of metal come from. There's also strips of carpet that are integrated into this work, and they have paint on them, so the texture has changed. They don't look soft anymore. But yeah, I love the idea of thinking about Dial's studio space as a home for all of these materials and all of his artworks, and that there's this interchangeable relationship between home and studio, and between materials and artworks building up over time. Yeah, I really love your idea of home as a kind of artistic medium. And I think that idea we think about as we look at this image, which where the photographer Margaret Morton has documented a home built by Mr. Yi-Po Lee. This photograph was taken in February of 1991. And Mr. Lee's home was located in the communal encampment known as the Hill, which was in Lower Manhattan. Let's look at a detail here. Mr. Lee was a resident of the Hill for many years, and over time, he seems to have added layers and layers to the house's exterior. I mean, I understand this is not maybe what many of us think of when we think of a conventional image of a house. However, there's clearly an outside and an inside, an exterior and an interior. From these photos, we can't get a glimpse of what's inside. But outside, the exterior seems to have served as a message board and maybe even acted as sort of a protective shield. When this photo was taken, Mr. Lee's home was decorated or embellished with banners, fruits, with messages and auspicious celebrating Lunar New Year. And I guess in this case, you know, the artist that this work is attributed to is usually the photographer Margaret Morton, who took the photo. But for Somewhere to Roost, I wanted to think about how Mr. Lee's construction of his home, using his actual living space, his dwelling, as a material out of which he makes this environment, this structure, this architecture, to think about his work as well. Okay, here's another artwork from the show Somewhere to Roost. The artwork in the show is pictured on the right of your screen here. And on the left, you can see the artist's actual home. This is Cedar Creek Charlie's work. And you can see on the left in this photo of his home's exterior, every surface was painted. The same was true about the interior of his home. All of the furniture, the doors, kitchen cabinets, everything was painted, often with brightly colored motifs involving dots and repeating patterns. And then the work that's in the show, he has recreated his home in a two-dimensional version using cardboard and string. And looking at this detail, we can see the different textures of the paper that Field sourced to work with, and how he has reproduced very similar pattern. If you compare the pattern he painted on the roof of his house to the pattern that he recreates on the roof of the cardboard house, I can definitely see this wavy lines and dots alternating on stripes. So now let's consider the artistic practice of Sister Gertrude Morgan in New Orleans, Louisiana. For Sister Gertrude Morgan, she invited visitors into her home in New Orleans, which was also her art studio, also an exhibition space where she exhibited her work, and a sacred space because she invited visitors in for worship services. That she was delivering sermons, she was reading scripture. So her home, her art, and her spiritual message all worked together. They all were materials, if you will, that she was working with, that all had some kind of relationship to her home. Let's look at a detail here. This in the bottom right hand corner of this image, the figure that is a self-portrait of Sister Gertrude, maybe in the act of preaching, and the structure that's visible in this work is her house, absolutely recognizable. Okay, so in this detail, she's writing excerpts from the Psalms, let us go into the house of the Lord. And it made me think about the idea of a house as a house of worship, a house of God. And I think with Morgan, the way that her home was also the site of religious practice, as well as being an art studio. And again, her artwork is carrying that same religious message as when she's reading scripture or preaching the gospel in her home.
Thank you so much. And I see we're going to the next part of our conversation, because so far we've been focusing on 20th century work, but home is also an integral part of historical folk art works, and such as painting that we see here on the screen, but also quilts. So how does the subject and the theme of home resurface in these historical folk art forms?
Yeah, thanks, Mathilde. We're going back to around 1815 when this painting was created. And This work by A.M.I. Phillips is a prized work, beloved work of folk portraiture in the museum's collection that was passed down through the family of the sitter for the portrait, who was a young boy at the time, Frederick A. Gale. That's who we're looking at in this painting. So we can imagine that this painting was on view, on display in the family's home, and eventually it passed into and was displayed in the homes of folk art collectors. That's sort of an understatement of truly dedicated folk art patrons and enthusiasts cherished this work after it was in Gale's family, and then gifted it to the folk art museum. So now this work has a new home in our museums, galleries, and storage facilities. And another angle for thinking about place and home with this work is thinking about how the artist A.M.I. Phillips worked as an itinerant portrait painter, meaning that he traveled seeking commissions of painting, seeking work in different towns. Phillips was active all up and down the Hudson River Valley in New England. And often his studio was mobile in that sense. And so his studio and then in his home temporarily was changing as he was getting work in different towns. Here are two more works painted by painters who worked as itinerant portrait artists. I have these works installed together in a group in the exhibition space so that they could operate kind of like a portrait gallery. I was imagining a gallery of family portraits. In the case of the work on the right, this is actually a family portrait. So Deborah Goldsmith painted this picture of her sister while she was living at her sister's home. Her sister was already married, and Deborah went and lived with her sister and her sister's husband while she was working on this painting. And if anyone's wondering if it was rare for women to work as itinerant portrait painters in the early 19th century, yes, it was. But Deborah Goldsmith started doing this kind of work from a very young age when she was a teenager. She traveled by stagecoach between towns. She was never traveling great distances away from her family's home. And she was always accompanied by usually a male family member. But nevertheless, she was earning an income by working on commissioned portraits like this one. And just for fun to talk about the work on the left quickly, reading the title is descriptive. It's just telling us that we're looking at a portrait of a young physician holding a surgical saw. So first of all, I just think about undergoing a surgical procedure in which that saw was used, which is not pleasant to think about. But in researching this painting, I learned that doctors, dentists, and even surgeons in the 18th and 19th centuries were also itinerant, were also traveling. So there's a story of an itinerant dentist who borrowed the slogan of an itinerant portrait painter. So the painter's slogan was "No likeness, no pay. If your portrait doesn't look like you, you don't have to pay for it." So the dentist coined the phrase "no cure, no pay." Now, the physician who's pictured here in this painting there's no evidence that he was a traveling physician. Actually, it's probably more likely that he got his medical degree in the US and then traveled to Europe for further medical training. Okay. And Mathilde, you mentioned quilts as well, and that quilts are a very important integral part of AFAM's collection for sure. And fascinating for including in this show because of how they're objects that are most often made in the home and also intended for use in the home as well. And this example has some more facets that we can talk about here. For example, the pieces that have been sewn together to make this quilt all came from blankets that were made with homespun wool. So that means that the wool itself, the raw wool from a sheep, was on a spinning wool, turned into usable yarn that was then dyed. All this work being done by hand, or maybe with, you know, the assistance of a spinning loom in the home. Let's look at a detail. So this quilt is unique in the sense that these wool blankets were sewn together into a quilt, and which could have happened many years after the blankets were originally made. It could have been the same maker, or it could have been someone else, could have been a descendant, a family member. And most, just reminds us that most domestic textiles like this were made in the home, usually by women, prior to industrialization, when textile mills began to large-scale production of these kinds of quilts and blankets. So a lot of innovation and resourcefulness was part of this process, and the products of this domestic labor served a much needed function of providing warmth and comfort.
Yes, and we know that a lot of quilters learned how to quilt from elders into the home setting, or it could be also a community setting. And we've been talking together about this, and how the art historian Julia Bryan Wilson wants to acknowledge that the role played by mothers, by grandmothers, by also aunts, and you mentioned that as well, and the role of this woman in transmitting needlework techniques. And so this historian prefers using the term mother-taught than self-taught. And I was thinking how this reconsideration of the term self-taught also reinforces your idea and your vision for the show of how the home, the domestic environment, is of great importance in our collection, and for artists who were not academically trained. So I'd love for you to expand on that.
Yeah, thanks, Mathilde. This term of being self-taught or not academically trained can be problematic, because it suggests that makers are lacking something, some kind of expertise or some kind of formal instruction. And that's at worst. I guess at best, it's just not very accurate or informative about the kinds of learning and experience and training that makers accumulate in the course of their lived experience. So yeah, I really appreciate changing our thinking and the language that we use to an orientation that's more open to considering being taught in your community, being community taught, or being mother taught, as you said. And this for me sets up the home, the domestic sphere, as a site of experimental creativity and technical material exploration and experimentation, and that essentially an artist's studio space. So I think objects like the quilts in AFAM's collection challenge us to rethink boundaries between works made in the home for use in the home, whether it's functional objects or as an artistic way of engaging with the space, and whether they're expressive or highly calculated, following a pattern. Yeah, just rethinking these boundaries between objects made in a domestic context and for primarily domestic audience and use, versus artworks made consciously for exhibition in an art show or museums. With this quilt, the maker has taken a traditional quilting pattern, and improvised and really pushed the pattern to its limits. So she's also kind of pushing boundaries here as well. And in a reversal of the industrialization of domestic labor that we were just talking about, I think it's fascinating to what we can try to retrace the journey of this quilt. We don't know the maker's identity, but there was a note that has traveled with the quilt suggesting that she was an African-American woman who worked in a textile factory. And indeed, there are thousands of small pieces, very small pieces of scraps, really, of wool in a set of, I think, four or five colors that repeat to make this quilt overall. So thinking that they were sewn together by hand. So thinking about the maker collecting these scraps of fabric and then creating this visually, optically stunning work, and the time that would have taken. So this idea of the home as being the studio, and the home is the site where this experimentation is happening. Then you want to talk about the work of James Castle. So in Castle's case, one thing we can think about is that home was also the site from which Castle gathered all of his materials. His parents ran a post office out of the family farm for a time, so there was a constant stream of paper coming in that he had access to. And he also sourced packaging materials and papers that he's using for his surfaces, but also he was gathering soot from the wood burning stove and mixing it with his saliva to create the watercolor pigment that you can see him using here. So it was his home studio and not an art school where that was the site of learning and developing his studio practice. And for Castle, home was also a subject, the subject matter of his work, much of his work, whether it was one of the two farms where he lived growing up, whether it was the Idaho School for the Deaf, where he spent about 5 years from the ages of 10 to 15 approximately, whether it was his family's home in Boise, Idaho. That's where this drawing was probably made. And so in Boise, he lived and worked first in a repurposed chicken shed that was just adjacent to his family's home. And then he had an art exhibition in the city of Boise. And with proceeds from the sale of his artwork, his family was able to buy a trailer that also sat on their property, to mention that it was a cozy cottage trailer. And that became Castle's home and workspace. But aside from that exhibition in Boise, Castle didn't live to see other public exhibitions of his work. But what I wanted to draw your attention to, if you can see my cursor hovering in the center top of this drawing, there is a hole in the paper. And let's look at the back as well. So this is the reverse of the drawing, and this is the hole in the back. But some conservation work has been done on the drawing, and I think part of that process involved patching in the hole. So there's kind of a piece of paper covering it up, but it's still there. And I think it testifies to the fact that Castle hung his work up in his studio living space. And there are some drawings that exist where he has depicted, tens of, even hundreds of his drawings installed, along with constructions, sculptures that he made, and handmade books. He's set up and arranged in a space as if it's an art exhibition, and made a drawing detailing each object in relation to the others. And so it is possible that this work was installed in an exhibition like this. We don't know if anyone besides Castle himself were audiences for these kind of exhibitions, but that's the kind of legacy that something as small as this pinprick hole kind of attests to. And you can also see him from looking at the back, we can see that he's using a health insurance beneficiary form for one of his drawings.
So interesting to think about these thin boundaries between the home, the studio, and the exhibition space, because Castle is also using his home and studio as an exhibition space for his drawing. So it's really fascinating. Um, Maybe yes, it's a good time now to focus on the photographs, including in the exhibition. And I'd love for you to talk about AFAM's collection of hand-tinted photographs and the way these vernacular photographs evoke a sense of home.
Yeah, so starting with the term vernacular, that just refers to the language, customs, practices of everyday life at home, in communities. With photography, as cameras became increasingly smaller and more affordable across the 20th century, photography became an activity that untrained or non-professional artists, photographers could participate in increasingly. Another layer of this increased accessibility is the practice of hand tinting that you mentioned, Mathilde, which is essentially painting on photographs with either a water-based or oil-based paint. That hand tinting process was often done in professional photography studios. However, kits were sold, and this was pretty widespread, that you could buy even at a local drugstore, a kit for tinting your own photos at home. So this created this opportunity for self-taught artists, let's say, to intervene in the photographs, maybe the ones that they had taken themselves of their home or their loved ones. I imagine sometimes it was the same person who took the photograph that then added the painting, but not always, right? So in this way, people were able to personalize their photos to highlight parts of the composition that interested them. And so for Somewhere to Roost, I wanted to choose photos from AFAM's collection of hand-tinted photos that in some way are set in the home, whether it's involving people in an interior setting, like in the photograph on the left. This one has a very cinematic quality, I think, with the light and the shadow, and it just makes me wonder, is this person watching television, or do they know they're being photographed? There's something very that really transcends, I guess, what we might imagine as like a casual snapshot that you might take of, during a birthday party or something. It's sort of like, wow, what's going on here? There's a lot going on. So other images are of the exteriors of homes. For example, the photo in the bottom right of your screen has a caption written in pencil at the top that says, "The back of our house, Cleveland Heights, Ohio." And because we have this caption, we can locate where this was taken. But I know when I first saw the image, before I read that writing, I was kind of transported, imagining where I thought that this home was. Something about the building material, whether it's stucco or what is used on the wall there. It looks like snow. Yeah, it's just sort of these photographs really ask a lot of questions that we don't have easy answers for, and I think that's part of what's powerful about them. And some of the home related photos are showing us interior spaces, like this one. And maybe it's the way that the chairs at this dining room table are slightly pulled out from the table, as if someone has just gotten up to leave, and hasn't pushed their chair back in. But someone, maybe the photographer, has added green tint to the lampshade over the table and to the drinking glasses. looks like a pale pink or a kind of mahogany brown has been added to the chairs, and the curtains have sort of a ghostly effect.
Yeah.
And overall, for me, this room is kind of feels frozen in time. But we don't know, is this a moment right before a family gathering or right afterwards? Has it been interrupted, or are we preparing, anticipating something? And I also wondered, is this a special occasion that's been documented by the photo, or are we witnessing a weekly or even a daily family ritual of a meal? Yeah, I like all of these unanswerable questions.
Yes, it's fascinating, and yes, there is something ghostly about this image for sure. Yeah, I was wondering how you approach all these vernacular photographs, and especially their styles or the aesthetics. Could we call them domestic art? Could we consider them as a form of domestic art?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've been talking about this sort of the mystery or the questions that these photographs, scenes of the spaces of everyday life um, seem to hold and contain. And also that sense that is, maybe coming from the medium of photography of feeling like a moment in time has been captured, but again, there's not necessarily, that doesn't mean that there's information or truth readily available about that moment. But I like your question, because terms like domestic art or vernacular art that have been applied to many of the works in AFAM's collection, and at the same time, these terms can carry dismissive connotations of being, quote unquote, low art versus, quote, high art, say, that you might expect to find in an art museum. And then we have the gendered connotations of domestic art being women's work, and in sexist terms, reinforcing an idea that women don't make serious art, or that their place is to stay inside the home, not out in the public sphere, taking action or expressing themselves or exhibiting their artwork, say. And again, what I think is really exciting about AFAM's collection is how the works here are representative of artistic practices that really cross these boundaries, trouble these boundaries, and kind of like just explode the ideas of preconceived ideas we have about what is art, what isn't, who is an artist, and who's a real artist, as we might have defined artists and artworks in art history, say. So thinking along these lines, we're looking here at two photographs that seem to be in a similar vein to the vernacular photos we were just looking at. And in fact, both of these photos document an artist's home, and they are kind of pieces of a much broader artistic practice at the same time. So they're kind of documenting this practice, and they're also part of the practice. Eugene von Brunkenhain on the right here, and Marie von Brunkenhain on the left, were married. And Eugene is very well known for his paintings and sculptural objects that he made in his home studio, as well as for thousands, or close to 1,000, of photographs of his wife Marie on the left. And this is one of those photos where Marie is posing, sitting on the edge of a couch. It's, we can sort of see under her dress a little bit. It's a little bit risque. Some of them are much, not, I would say much more provocative, but a little more provocative. I chose this one in part because of the photographic portrait of Marie that is hanging on the wall behind her in this photo. So it's a picture within a picture, and I couldn't resist that. So Eugene is credited with being the photographer and the artist behind these works. Often the photographs of Marie are pretty elaborately staged with backdrops. She's in different costumes and different poses, and she's often actually, on the dining room table, but it's been covered with various quilts and tapestries, so she appears to be in an exotic location. It's sort of a pinup fantasy. And going back to these images, the house on the left here is the couple's home in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And on the right, we're seeing an interior of a desk, a table. It has, I think, it looks like a couple of radios on it, and some of Eugene's sculptures that are sort of like crowns resting on this table. Here made me pause a bit because he's inspecting his cacti. He was a big fan of succulents and cacti. He doesn't seem like he knows he's being photographed, though, and so I imagine that in this insular world that these two were making art, living in and making art in, that Marie may have taken this photo, probably took this photo. And that opened up space for me to think, well, Marie probably had a very active role in all of the photos that were taken of her by Eugene, because in choosing the poses, the costumes, the set design, if you will, I started to think, I wonder how much this was a collaborative project between two artists working in their home or studio.
Yeah, thank you so much for recovering the role played by her so I think that's really interesting to think about this interrelationship, and also it's fascinating to think with these images and what they reveal to us about the collaborative aspect of the work, and also thinking about our domestic life, but also the setting provides such a great framework for great art. And I love that idea. It's really, really strong in the exhibition. And so far we've been really looking at artists who were living freely in their home, were free of movement. But we wanted also through this discussion to also discuss about artists in our discussion, and we should not forget that many artists in our collection were institutionalized, and so had to leave their family home and were not free of movement. So what sense of home do these artists articulate in their works?
Yeah. We've been exploring this idea of of a home domestic setting as a crucible for artistic experimentation and studio practice and even collaboration. And what happens, or what does it mean when for those of us who don't have access to a stable home, a safe place to stay, or don't have a lot of agency or choice about where we stay, or who what about an artist who's making artwork outside, very much outside of the home and outside of the studio? So that brings us to this work by Lee Godey. And she has signed the work in the center. It is difficult to see here, but she doesn't sign just her name. She writes artist Lee Godey. And wanted to return for a moment to the title of Thornton Dial's painting, Birds Got to Have Somewhere to Roost. These two birds pictured here they have found some tree branches, it looks like, to hold on to. And Lee Godey apparently told a story that it was a red bird who carried a message encouraging her to start painting. And either way, I thought this work and the place, the setting, the environment that it was made in, really kind of encapsulates a lot of the tensions around the idea of home, and that I wanted to explore in the show. So let's go to this. Sorry, I just lost my place in my notes here. Come back.
Yeah, we have snapshots and self-portraits now of her, of Ligodi.
Got it. Thanks. So we're looking at Ligodi herself. On the left is a photo that some art collectors who were visiting her and documenting her practice took in the 1980s. And on the right, it's a self-portrait that Godi took of herself. It's one of many that she made in a photo booth, in a public photo booth. I think in the Amtrak station, or the Greyhound station. This photo is the self-portrait. She's posing with her palette, and it's a rolled up piece of canvas that she's holding. So she's got her artist tools and materials. And I also love the detail of the cameo brooch that the silhouette that she's wearing as well. She's identifying herself as an artist, right? She signed this work as Artist Ligodi, and this work, the surface it's on, is a piece of unstretched primed canvas. And I have a feeling that could be what she's holding, the rolled up version of here. And Godi spent decades without a fixed home. She was living on the streets of Chicago. On the left, in the snapshot, she's on the steps of the Art Institute of Chicago. And that is where she spent much of her time. She made some of her work there. She certainly sold her artwork there. She identified as an impressionist. And there was a big show of French Impressionism at the Art Institute of Chicago in the late 1960s or early 1970s that I've wondered if she visited the show. And here is an artwork by Frank Albert Jones, which to kind of draw your attention to the roof-like shape of the top of this image, this construction. There's what looks like a clock on the right-hand side. And there are many, many compartments, sections, and the walls of those look like they're made of spikes or flames or some kind of repeating element. And I've noticed that I can't see or find any way to travel between these compartments. I don't see any doors or kind of ways in or out. Here is Frank Jones. He's at work on a drawing, or at least he is posing as if he is at work on his drawings. It's hard to see, but on the table there are a stack of his drawings. He always used red and blue accountant's pencils on paper. I recently discovered that they are erasable, which it was exciting thinking about that additional aspect to the materials he's using, that he was able to erase them if he wanted to, and to then redraw. He also used colored pencils later. And all of Jones's known works were made while he was incarcerated at Huntsville Penitentiary in Texas in the 1960s. And as a Black man who was also disabled, looming questions remain about Jones' time in prison. He maintained his innocence, and serious concerns about ongoing injustices in the US criminal justice system need to be part of this conversation. There's a detail, we can appreciate the artistry of Jones' work. It is visually fascinating and beguiling. And at the same time, bearing in mind that these drawings were made under conditions of unfreedom. In the bottom center here, you can see that Frank Jones signed his drawing as he always did with his prison number 114591. Let's just go back to a view of the artwork.
An extraordinary drawing, and I have to say one of my favorite of the exhibition. And in the context of this conversation, this program, I think this drawing really opens an alternative view on the American home, or something that is more distressing, and sense of home that is full of fear and discomfort. So I would love to wrap up this conversation thinking about the way that your selection of artworks really expand, if not challenge, our sense of home or our understanding of the American home. And if you want to talk about that.
Yeah. Thanks, Mathilde. Yeah, this drawing by Frank Jones was another work that I saw in AFAM's storage. So it was the first time I was seeing one of his works in person. And like the first painting we looked at by Mike Perez with the bird and the owl and the Camino Real, for me, encountering those works in collection storage, I just was thinking, like, what exhibition, how can I build an exhibition around these works in many ways? Because of and I guess, yeah, my process was thinking, what's one thing that these works are doing, how they could be in conversation with each other, and also with works of historical folk art or with quilts. And it was this idea of reflecting on, what is an American home in terms of the United States or of the Americas more broadly, reflecting on that question, and also kind of pushing back on any kind of any notion that there's a unified narrative or idea about what the American home is. So this
Here we are.
here's one example, and this is a work from the early 19th century. It's incredibly detailed watercolor painting, and it was made during the early years of the United States as a nation, the early years of the existence of the United States. And the setting is a tavern in New Hampshire. New Hampshire was one of the original 13 British colonies that became the United States. You go detailed here. You can see that the wall decorations, the floor decorations, they are depicted here in minute details. They would have been stenciled on the actual walls of the space. And the artist is Joseph Warren Levitt. He is depicting his home, which was also a tavern operated by his father. The person doing some kind of needlework over here by the hearth is Sally Morse, who was the artist's cousin. I don't know who this figure with a cane and a hat is walking through these. I love how this work takes us across thresholds and through doorways that open onto other doorways that open into other doorways, kind of in like this mise en abîme passageway. So I don't know who this figure is who's departing the scene, but on the right, this figure with the blue waistcoat and trousers was very well known at the time, and he was the Marquis de Lafayette, a French military officer, and he was active in the U.S. War of Independence and then later in the French Revolution. And he's here in Levitt's Tavern because he was making a sort of publicity tour. At this time, he was around 1825. He was in his later years of his life, but he was touring different parts of the new United States as a war hero, as a figure who carried a lot of symbolic importance, I think, about what the principles of the United States were. And we're seeing this work of folk art that depicts, an American home that might have been seen at the time as ideal, as a site for the Marquis de Lafayette's, for a stop on his tour. And this painting is also like a historical record of this moment in time. In a way, it sort of operates like a photograph or like a snapshot, and it also communicates, I think, a lot about the values that were held by this group of people at this time. So we certainly have works like this in AFAM's collection, and we also have works like this. So once again, an artwork that stops me in my tracks in collection storage. And it's another depiction of what could be a home or a house, or at least some kind of structure that could serve as a home. And this is a drawing by Inez Nathaniel Walker. And she made while she was living in upstate New York. So during Walker's life, there's a trajectory and a changing of locations. She was born in South Carolina, and then she spent time in Philadelphia and eventually settled in upstate New York. And like many African Americans of her generation, she was making these relocations as part of the Great Migration. So that's kind of in the back of my mind with thinking about how the artist is depicting a home or a structure here. You know, again, is it an image that she's conjuring from memory? Is it a current place that she spends time? Is it an imagined place? There's a sense of presence that this house has. For me, that's kind of what drew my attention to this. It looks like it's full of a buzzing energy, almost like it might start walking on these four legs at any moment. And
it looks like a fortress too. I feel like, no?
It looks like a fortress too. It's almost solid, yeah. Somehow, even though, you know, we can see the color of the paper showing through some of the dots, it looks pretty impenetrable, I would say. Yeah. These details, this patterning that Walker's using, what's a couple more things that are interesting about this work. She's using marker here, felt tip pen, and graphite pencil. But this is unusual because actually we have something like close to 400 drawings by Inez Nathaniel Walker in AFAM's collection. But the vast majority of those, she doesn't use marker, she uses colored pencil. So that's one thing that makes me want to learn more about this drawing. And then the second thing is that Walker's work, all these hundreds of drawings, it's almost always portraiture. Often just the portrait of one figure, sometimes two people in conversation, more rarely figures in an interior space, very rarely. So to see her depict the exterior of a structure like this I've never seen another work by hers like this. So it's also notable to consider that a lot of Walker's works that are known to us in the museum context may have been made in art therapy. During a brief time of being incarcerated, she may have participated in some occupational therapy programming. And when she died, she was living in a psychiatric hospital where she made some work she was working with an art therapist, I believe. So there's a lot more research that I would like to do about this artist working in these institutional contexts. And this drawing in particular makes me think about institutional homes, usually not ones that we would choose or often not consented to, but the importance for keeping in mind the lived experience of artists, as well as the context in which their works were made, not in a way of sensationalizing or fetishizing at all, but rather to acknowledge the history of these artworks and the lived histories of their makers. And most of all, I think to acknowledge that there's so much that we don't know and maybe can't know. So when we're, someone like myself in this role of talking about this artwork and making interpretations about it, always trying to keep in mind that I know very little about this artist's experience and how she conceptualized, herself as an artist, or these images that she created. And I try to learn from studying how she made what she made. Why did she make the decisions that she did in terms of these materials, in terms of using marker here versus colored pencils, like I said, as one example.
Thank you for sharing these two works together. This juxtaposition of Levitt and the Walkers is, I think, very generative, and maybe I would like to wrap up and end this conversation on that note, on all the unexpected pairing that you made and created in the exhibition. I think that really challenges our understanding of what is a home in America, and I would like to thank you for your research, for this incredible research. It was a pleasure to view all this work, and I hope our audience will be able to see all these works in person very soon, if they haven't come yet to see it. Yes, maybe I would love to. I would like to invite our audience to ask questions, and we have a few minutes left, and I would love to share your questions to Brooke. I see that we have a question about the troop portrait that came along the talk through the talk. Diane is asking you, for the artist's true portrait, the artist seems to have died young, yet the picture was donated by a relative. When was that, and how did it stay in the family's possession, and then why taken into the museum's collection? Thank you.
So Diane has done some excellent detective work, which is turns out to be a big part of the job of being a curator or an art historian, I think, trying to ask these questions and fill in some of these gaps. So I guess I can quickly go back. Apologies for these flashing images. Let's go back to talking about the portrait here on the right by Deborah Goldsmith Throop. And Diane has noticed that Deborah Goldsmith was young, very young when she died. And I can share as much as I have gleaned from my research, which is that as we were talking about, she was working as a traveling itinerant portrait painter starting in her teens. There's been speculation that this was to earn extra income to support her family. And once she married, and she had, I believe, 2 or 3 children, she was no longer working as an itinerant portrait painter when she got married, and I believe she died of an illness. So that took her life when she was, still very young, and rightfully so. You've noticed that this painting is part of the museum's collection because of a gift from Anne Throop Leighton, who is a direct descendant of the painter. And it's in many ways an ideal situation where this painting stayed in the homes of family members of the artist and passed down through generations. So I believe that Anne Throop Leighton may be a great granddaughter even of Deborah Goldsmith Throop. So Goldsmith was her maiden name and Throop her married name. So when she made this painting, she was making it as Deborah Goldsmith. And her work, for the techniques that she was developing and using, again, at such a young age, her work has a special place in the history of folk portraiture. Some of her commissions are portraits of entire families in interior settings. So you can see the stenciled wall coverings or wallpaper in the background. You can see parents and children all kind of seated. and remembering that Deborah Goldsmith would have been living at the home often of the families of people that were commissioning portraits from her. Yeah.
Thank you, Brooke. Please share your questions if you have any other questions for us. We'll be happy to take them. I don't see any more questions, but let's wait for a few minutes. I know that you have another interesting juxtaposition in your slides, so maybe we can look into that, and while waiting for another person to ask a question, if there are more questions from our audience. I was yes, I know that there was a you've been talking about the two houses. I don't know if you have an image of that. Yes, and juxtaposition being also the work of curating and exhibiting works together. So if you can talk about what came from that meeting in person.
It's another aspect of working with AFAM's collection that I have been learning a lot from, is this juxtaposition of works from the historical folk art world of the collection, like this bird cage on the right from about 1861, and this house made of bottle caps from around 1961. So we have a juxtaposition between so many juxtapositions happening here, but the subject matter of each of these works of sculpture is a house for a bird, a cage for a bird on the right, and the bottle cap kind of iconic image of a structure of a house on the left. And what was really fun about this exhibition, and the reason why I went back to this image, is because these works ended up next to each other in the installation. They're in this case over here, just as these works ended up together. And it wasn't a lot of the planning for that had to do with logistics of the exhibition furniture that we had. We had to commission this case to be, tailor-made for this gallery space. And we were, works like these are so detailed that we ended up putting them in a specific case because of its height, and in terms of accessibility, we wanted someone who was viewing the works from a seated position in a wheelchair, for example, to be able to have a decent view of the details here. So those kind of logistical questions were shaping our work. And then when, having a chance to spend time in the exhibition after it was installed, I started to see, like, wow, here, for example, this juxtaposition between centuries is really amplified by the almost clash between the materials on the right. So finely carved whalebone that is creating all these finials and the bars of the cage with Peruvian mahogany supports, and knowing that Clarence and Grace Woolsey, the story goes, it was a wintry night in 1961, and they were snowed in their farmhouse in Iowa, and they said, let's do something with all of these bottle caps that we've been collecting. And they punched holes in each one, strung them together, created quite a few objects, many houses. Others are kind of figural, and then they arranged these works in an exhibition. They called it their cap arena. And it's interesting how such different materials in each of these works are still operating somehow. There's something about repetition that's happening in each. There's something about space that is open and you can move through, but that's all, the air can move through, but a bird wouldn't be able to move through the bars of the cage. So this tension between inside and outside really comes through in both of these works, and it's those kinds of unexpected relationships, I think, that are very exciting in AFAM's collection, because they're everywhere. They're, you can really follow these, learn so much from these objects, and then also their relationships with one another.